Sego, I am John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, June 1st. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but the real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that has been heaped upon us. And we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk native. But first, let me remind people that our show, our audio of our show streams at www.letstalknative.com. And there's a lot more than that there. So I encourage you to check out our website. And we stream live video of the show on Facebook Live. Our shows are available as podcasts on your favorite podcast platform after the broadcast. And we post video of our show on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. I am the host of Let's Talk Native, and I am assisted by Jake Proud here in studio, who is managing our video and our sound. I got a few things to kind of get out there, but let me start by thanking Peter Dorico for joining me on my show in New York. I do a show every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on WBAI in New York City. And Peter Dorico, who's a friend of mine, he's an attorney. He was a law professor at UMass at Amherst. He joined me for the show. We talked a little bit about one of the topics I talked about here, which was the Neil Gorsuch rulings on the two cases, the one involving the Yakima and the other one involving the Crow. But we tried to put the whole, Trump appointee in to the Supreme Court in its proper perspective, and not shying away from the fact that we have bad rulings that come from the liberals and from the conservatives on the court. So Peter was a great guest. It was a good show. I encourage you to check it out. We do Facebook live stream that show as well, so you can watch the Facebook video, and we'll get that video posted on our YouTube channel, and it'll get posted on our podcast here. It's not up yet, right? The podcast, yeah. So that'll get posted as well. So, but do check it out. It was quite a good show, and I encourage you, those of you who listen to this show, by all means, check out my show in New York next week. I've got Lance Gums who's going to join me, possibly even in studio. We're going to talk about those poor rich white people out in the Hamptons who are having a heart attack over the fact that the Shinnecock put up a digital billboard. It's just a money venture. It's something they put up there to generate revenue for. They don't have a casino. They don't have a whole lot of nation enterprises, but they decided they put up two large billboards that they could sell time and space on, and the white people had a fit. I mean, it's reminiscent of these white people who have lost their mind over the Ramapo having property just on the outside of their gated community. And here you've got the wealthy elite, liberal wealthy elite, I might add, in the Hamptons of Long Island, just pitching a fit because they think the Shinnecock are destroying their landscape. And they go so far as to say that they're upsetting the natural beauty. Well, what the hell did your mansions on the seaside do, for crying out loud? It's just absurd. But anyway, Lance Gums is going to join me on my show in New York, and so I encourage you to check that show out. Again, that's Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. If you're in New York City, you can catch us at 99.5 on the FM dial, or you can go to WBAI.org and catch the audio there, or you can just follow us on Facebook, and we'll Facebook live stream the show. So there's that. Look, one of my friends posted on my Facebook group page the Mark Charles announcement. Yay! Mark Charles is running for president of the United States. If you don't remember who Mark Charles is, he's the guy that I kind of blasted because he's being touted as an expert on the doctrine of Christian discovery. But his whole take on the doctrine of Christian discovery is, yes, they treated us like animals and they stole all our land, and they decided that discovery of us was tantamount to conquering us, and so we've been conquered, and yet we're not equal in the eyes of the Constitution. And so he gets into this whole "we the people" thing. So rather than looking at the doctrine of discovery and saying this was so wrong on so many different levels, and and making the case that by exposing what the doctrine of discovery is, we are strong to make our case that we have the right to an independent existence. But that's not where Mark Charles is going. No, Mark Charles, he believes that talking about the doctrine of discovery is fodder for better assimilation. I mean, now this guy who's, I think, Navajo on his mother's side, and he's white on his father's side or something like that, is gonna, and he doesn't even live in Navajo territory. Okay, just to be clear, he lives in Washington D.C. and he's gonna run for president of the United States. So he's joining the other 25 or so people running for the Democratic nomination. Of course, it's a publicity stunt. You know, look, Jake even suggested that he's probably going to have this failed effort and then launch a book tour afterwards, and which is probably right. Or maybe he'll do another TED talk on losing the Democratic nomination or something like that. But no, this guy, you know, again, I get into this war of words with so many people. I posted something on around Memorial Day, and I said, look, all those guys who died wearing a U.S. military uniform, they didn't die defending my freedom. They didn't die for me. And I'm not saying they didn't die for anything. I'm not saying that they wasted their lives, and I wasn't even condemning them. I'm just saying, look, if you're Native and you join the military, you're not fighting for Native issues, and you're not fighting for freedom of speech or gun, right to bear arms, none of that stuff. You've just became a pawn of the U.S. military. I mean, you're just part of that war machine, the military-industrial complex. You're the foot soldier. That's what you signed up for. Whatever reason you did, you didn't do it to defend Native territory. You didn't do it to defend our free and independent existence. No, you took an oath to stand for America, for the United States, and their global domination. That's what you did. Now, that may not be the reason you did it. Maybe maybe you really did fight in World War II because of what the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I don't know. I mean, of course, the reason they bombed Pearl Harbor is because the U.S. was building up a huge military force in the South Pacific, and was essentially threatening them. And it would have been probably a little bit better if all those Native people who thought joining the U.S. military over Pearl Harbor, maybe they should have spoke up a little bit louder when the United States invaded Hawaii and took the land away from did a coup essentially against the Hawaiian kingdom, imprisoned and held hostage the queen of Liliuokalani, held her hostage. I mean, the U.S. invaded Hawaii. They invaded Hawaii. The Japanese didn't invade Hawaii. They bombed a naval target. Of course, the United States, they didn't bomb just military targets when they bombed Japan. They bombed, over a half dozen cities, two of which they dropped nuclear weapons on. The only country in the world that's ever dropped a nuclear bomb on people, not soldiers, not military targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So look, I realize that as I say in my opening, I'm going to step on a few toes. I am not condemning people for joining the military. There's a lot of reasons people do it, and most of them aren't really good. I mean, they aren't. Most of them had to do with our circumstance. Look, that whole residential school experience that shaped our young men for little more than to join the military. That's what that whole thing. They were teaching kids to march, put them in uniforms. They give them little wooden sticks like guns that they could carry on their shoulders. Look, residential schools was essentially pre-military. That's what it was for. But when you take away so much native land, and you take away our livelihoods, and you try to destroy our language, except for when you can weaponize it. Yeah, I know the code talkers. We're supposed to have so much respect for the code talkers. They were just other enlisted men. However they got there, whether they were drafted, whether they enlisted, whether they look, there are plenty of stories of people who were brought up in front of a judge, and the judge says, "Look, you can either join the military or I'm going to throw you in jail for whatever reason." There's a lot of reasons that Native people became soldiers for World War II. Now, some of them, once the U.S. military realized that the Japanese, more so even than the Germans, were experts at breaking codes, thought, oh, well, if we use native language or as part of the code, then we can exploit a language, the same language we're trying to kill back home. We'll use it in the field. So I mean, look, if this offends a bunch of people, I'm not trying to condemn people for joining the military. I'm just saying you didn't do it for us. You did it for America. If you joined because of 9/11, all right, you're an American hero. You and who did you when you joined and you were going to go there and kick some ass? Did you go to Saudi Arabia? Because you remember the guys who did it, who at least the United States claims did it. They were from Saudi Arabia, including Bin Laden. I mean, they were even funded by Saudis. But no, most of you end up going to Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with it. I mean, so look, I've got a meme that I posted a while back that said, the final stages of oppression, genocide, is when the oppressed people fight their last battle for the very country that oppressed them, and do so to oppress other people, and then they stand in line to vote, thinking that that's their expression of freedom. I mean, that's genocide. I mean, when you become a witting participant in your own perishing culture, because what you're trying to endear yourself to Americans, to the United States, the country that committed mass murder against our people. They raped our women. They orphaned our children. They took children away from us and put them in residential schools for 100 freaking years. Now, look, if you joined the military because you thought that was some way that you could gain some respectability back from because you lived in a territory that was, living in abject poverty were your only options. Look, I get that. And I'm not saying don't be proud of what you did. If you think fighting Nazis or the Taliban or whoever you think you were fighting or you were fighting, I don't know if anybody who was proud of killing Vietnamese. I'm not sure what to think about that, but because that had nothing to do with the United States being attacked by anybody. I mean, that had to do with an ideology that the United States had about stopping communism. Although it is kind of peculiar when you think about it. You look back, the United States is allies with Germany now, allies with Japan now, allies with communist countries like China and look, they could say that China and Russia are adversaries, unless you're Trump, and then if you're Trump, then Russia's your friend, but China's you're in a trade war with. I mean, look, our people should not be enlisting in their military, and regardless of what took place in the past, I would hope that Native people do not encourage their children and their grandchildren to become the weapons of the United States, the pawns of the United States. I mean, the United States is the only global threat to peace. They are the only global threat to peace. I mean, look, somebody can light a bomb and do an improvised explosive device, maybe even fly a plane into a skyscraper. But in terms of wiping out people, in terms of really oppressing people, the United States isn't just guilty of genocide against indigenous people in North America. And look, I got to include Canada in all this stuff. So, I mean, I said whatever I said about enlisting with the U.S. Armed Forces, it's the same thing with Canada. U.S. and Canada are not just guilty of committing crimes against indigenous people in North America. They're doing it all over the world. The United States in particular, more so than Canada. But look, they got troops everywhere. 70 countries the United States has military bases or military presence in. If any other country, if with China develops any military presence around China, and the United States looks at that as an act of aggression. So look, I'm not gonna heroize U.S. veterans. That's my choice. I mean, I don't have to do that, right? I'm not condemning everybody who enlisted, but just be clear: you enlisted in the military of a country that committed genocide, that not only did commit genocide, but continues to commit genocide against Native people. I mean, you can justify it any way you want. 9/11, Nazis, Holocaust. I mean, whatever. You, you you think you know what communism is and you oppose that. Whatever. You can take that any way you want. But um, I just think it's important that we realize that the U.S. military. There wasn't some day that the U.S. military all of a sudden became our friend after committing massacres against our people, after imprisoning us on quote unquote reservations. I mean, at what point? I mean, it's kind of crazy because Native people began enlisting at a pretty high rate even for World War One. I'm going to tell you that's I mean the shadow of the massacre at Wounded Knee was still fresh in people's memories. I mean, the fact that coming out of the Civil War, the United States went all in waging war against Native people, right up to the point, of massacres, including Sand Creek and Wounded Knee, and then would rip our children out of our homes up until the 1970s in the United States and the 1990s in Canada, where the mortality rate was as high as 50% in some of those schools. I mean, between the the actual rape and murder of our kids in those schools, the malnutrition, the lack of adequate health care, or oftentimes putting them in a health risk, especially with tuberculosis, by failing to quarantine or give proper ventilation, none of that stuff, and then making the conditions so intolerable that many kids died running away from these schools, both in the U.S. and on the Canadian side. They died freezing to death on a set of railroad tracks trying to go home, and to homes that oftentimes were hundreds, if not 1,000 miles away from where these schools were located from their homes. So, look, I don't know how people justify enlisting in the military, and then touting. I mean, I have a problem with the whole powwow thing that all these powwows have been turned into veterans powwows. Well, what about our people who fought the United States and who are fighting them every day, whether when it comes to pipelines or fighting, contamination of our rivers or whatever else? I mean, we're still at war at some level. But again, if the only thing that you can brag about is having been enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces, I hope you do, including these code talkers. I've said this before. I hope that some of these guys who had their language exploited by the U.S. military, I hope some of them were language teachers. I'd like to think that even though they were exploited for their language while in military service, that perhaps they taught the language and they did other good things with their lives. I know not all of them did. I mean, heck, Peter McDonald, he goes around bragging, was so boastful about being a code talker. This guy went to prison for embezzling money from from the Navajo. So I don't know. But, look, all I can say is that if you enlist in the U.S. or Canadian Armed Forces, you're not doing it to serve Native people. You're doing it to serve the United States and Canada, and those two countries. They were two of the four who voted against the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and who still stand in stark violation of the document. I mean, I just think it almost goes without saying that the United States and Canada are probably the most guilty nations in the world of violating the articles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And you can start right from the preamble. Like I always read that preamble because as we talk about the doctrine of Christian discovery, in the third affirmation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they essentially repudiate it. They say all doctrines and policies and practices that promote superiority based on national origin or ethnicity or religion or race are that it's scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, legally invalid. I mean, that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says about such a thing. And if you start from that premise, almost the entire house of cards that is the U.S. Set of laws that they call federal Indian law, which are really federal laws about Indians, including IGRA. We can go right up all the way through. The idea that they're asserting this kind of power over our people is really kind of absurd. So, look, I wanted to address, poke a little bit of fun at Mark Charles in this publicity stunt of his. I mean, obviously, most people don't even know who he is. And look, and if you're Native, don't just think because a Native guy is running for office that you need. I mean, the guy he's more assimilated. Yeah, I know he's got long hair and that kind of thing, but this guy promotes assimilation. He wants to be a good American, and he wants to be counted as a good American. That's what he wants. He's not fighting for our distinction or autonomy or sovereignty. No, that's not what Mark Charles is about. I mean, and frankly, any of these ones who run for office, whether it's Deborah Hallen or Sharice Davids or the Republicans, I can't even think of half the guys that are. I mean, there are Republicans, Native people too. Don't forget, Oklahoma, not exactly a Democratic stronghold. And these people aren't promoting Native autonomy. None of them, in the right or the left, they're not promoting Native autonomy. They're promoting inclusion. And they may push a few Native issues. I've heard Deborah Haaland talking about, condemning the Interior Department for some of, what they've been doing wrong and going after a few other agencies that have been derelict in their responsibilities to their so-called trust relationship. And put some noise out there about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And look, all that's good. I think raising awareness and doing that kind of stuff, I support that. But you know what? These people get elected by white people. And that's who they really serve. At the end of the day, when you look at somebody's legislative track record down the road, you're going to find that these Native politicians didn't do a whole lot. They didn't create a whole lot of legislation. And what we really need to do is undo some of this legislation. I mean, we have a hard time getting the federal government to do the things that they've already legislated to do. I mean, IGRA comes to mind. I mean, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the Interior Department is the federal agency charged with making sure that states aren't violating the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and they don't do it. They're completely derelict in their responsibility. They half the time they won't even weigh in if there's a dispute. They won't reject a compact. They'll look the other way, and I'm going to talk about that in the second half of the show because it turns out I talked last week about the Buffalo News and their racist rant calling the Senecas cheats and liars, and I don't know, they went on and on. There was a whole list of the Senecas aren't as good as their word. I mean, just went on and on. Well, they're not alone. The another local paper out of Lockport, New York, which is not far from it's a Buffalo suburb. The Lockport Journal, they joined right in with the Buffalo News and with more of the rant. In fact, they went a little farther to blame the Senecas for the fact that Niagara Falls has old fire trucks. I mean, $250 million went to Niagara Falls from Seneca Gaming, indirectly through this revenue sharing. And the fact that they have old fire trucks is somehow the Seneca's fault. And that's what the Lockport Journal wrote in one of their editorials this week. And we'll talk about that when we come back. But we'll take a break and we'll come back and I'll get into the Lockport Journal. And I want to address what their main issue was, which is their argument was that binding arbitration means binding arbitration. Well, we'll talk about what binding arbitration really means when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
candlelight dinners and no fine French wine. I love you, baby, but I forget to say. I know it's wrong, but I'm just that way. Feel the light, feel the light. Something going on. Feel the light, and it feels like we got trouble in the way. I'm here to tell you it wasn't always this way. Call me, baby, 10 times.
All right, thanks for coming back. I want to thank our sponsors. Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, a few folks that choose to remain unnamed, I guess, and an occasional check drops in the mail every once in a while. And that support really enables us to do what we do here, and it enables me to take the trip to New York and do a show in New York City every week. We've been slowly upgrading some of our equipment, and so those donations, those contributions, not just from our the folks who support the show on a regular basis, but those of you who drop something on occasion, we put that money to use here. So I want to thank you for your consistent support, and for those who make contributions when they can. I also want to thank all of you who contribute your comments that we look for on our Facebook live stream, and to my Facebook posts and my tweets and that kind of stuff. I do appreciate the exchange, even though I know some of you aren't going to agree with me. I put stuff out there that I know is it can be contentious, because oftentimes it's not the widely held conversations that people are having. So I want to thank all of you who contribute in the dialogue. I also want to thank those of you who share the show. My wife in particular, who shares the Facebook live stream on so many of these other group pages. I want to thank those who run these Facebook group pages, the administrators, for allowing us to share our show on your pages. It is the way we spread the word. It's the way we get it out there and have more of a conversation. And you know what? Look, for me, the greatest reward that I get back is when I put something out there and somebody says, "Man, I'm glad you said that. I've been waiting for somebody to say something just like that," because I know some of the things that I'm expressing are not the things that all those iconic individuals and all those guys who are heroes and that kind of stuff, celebrities that are out there saying. I'm saying something that's maybe a little tough, a little uncomfortable truth, I guess. And so that's what we do here. So I want to thank all of you for sharing the show on Facebook, sharing our podcast, sharing our YouTube videos, and participating. And you know what? If you haven't, then I encourage you to do so. This is the way we promote the conversation. All right, let me get into it a little bit. Lockport Journal, they wrote an editorial, and their main point was that the binding arbitration should be binding. Now, and here's the thing: what the arbitration panel was supposed to do was to resolve a dispute, and in their ruling on this on the compact, where they said, even though, and these are their words, the compact was silent on payments continuing past 14 years. They did an interpretation, and they made some assumptions that first off, they made assumptions that the compact, as it was negotiated in 2002, their assumption was that the compact as negotiated in 2002 intended for the payments to continue. Now, to continue past 14 years. The crazy part is these arbitrators never called the Pataki administration, to testify. They never brought the representatives of the state from 2002 up. They're using the interpretation from the Cuomo administration today, who says, "Oh, no, it was supposed to continue." Well, how do you know? I mean, how did the arbitrators even know that those who actually negotiated on behalf of the state that they had any intention of these payments continuing past 14 years? I mean, because there's nothing to suggest that. I mean, and to have the Cuomo administration offering their interpretation of what the Pataki administration meant is really kind of absurd. I mean, there was no point that the arbitration panel said, well, we need to hear from those who represented the state in 2002. In order for us to make this assumption that the state believed that the payments are going to continue. Now, this is ignoring what the Senecas believed, because basically the Senecas are the same people, right? The Senecas are the same Senecas essentially that were there in 2002 that are there today. I mean, they don't change politically in the same way that a Republican governor, who serves as governor versus a Democrat who serves as governor. I mean, it's a complete changeover when you have a party changeover. It's a complete changeover from governor to governor, but it's even more so when you go from a Republican governor like George Pataki to a Democratic governor like Andrew Cuomo. So you have these arbitration panel, the two non-native guys on the arbitration panel, I guess, because if I say that they're white, somehow I'm being racist, but the two non-native people on the arbitration panel said, well, of course the payments should continue. Why should the Senecas get an exclusivity that continues if they don't pay? Well, they never even looked at what the exclusivity is. So the logical thing for the Senecas to do, considering that two of these three judges in this arbitration panel were now going to add language that wasn't there, and was now going to say, they were going to dictate to the Senecas, well, here is what you agreed to, which is not what the Senecas agreed to. The Senecas agreed to pay for 14 years. Now, we could debate whether whether an exclusivity ever existed, and whether the exclusivity that in its really, really, ridiculous form, whether it should even continue. Because you could argue that the Senecas paid so much money for 14 years. I mean, $1.5 billion. You could argue that they paid for whatever that exclusivity is, indefinitely. But that's not even, that's not even an argument worth making. The fact is that the Senecas paid an ever-increasing percentage of their slot revenue to the state as the state reduced the value of the exclusivity. And how'd they do that? Well, they put slot machines in their racetracks. They approved casino gaming. They competed directly against the Senecas to the extent that their laws allowed them to. Nothing in the compact stopped the state from doing anything, competing against the Senecas. Nothing in the compact did. But again, I don't want to get too far off of what Lockport is saying, the Lockport Journal. They're saying this ruling from the arbitration, it was a binding arbitration, so it should be binding. Well, that's fine. All right. We can accept the fact that the arbitration panel ruled that that they interpret the compact as requiring payments to continue. Well, here's the problem with that. It changes what the Senecas agreed to. Now, when the Interior Department has to approve a compact, they also have to approve changes in a compact. Now, a couple of things are changing now, but back when the compact was first submitted to the Interior Department didn't approve it. They didn't reject it, but they remained quiet on the issue. They let it go through without approval because that was their third choice. They could approve, they could reject, or they could punt, and that's what they did. Now, part of the reason they punted is because both parties agreed. Both the state and the Senecas agreed with what they had negotiated. The Interior Department had a problem with some of the language, but if the Senecas were okay with it, as far as the Interior Department said, well, we're going to let it go. Both parties agree. That's not what you have now. Now you have a changed compact because you had two non-native people sitting on this arbitration panel that says, well, even though the language didn't say that the payments should continue. In fact, the language said payments were only through 14 years. We're going to tell you that this compact needs to have the payments continue. So you have two non-native arbitrators telling the Senecas what they have to do. This is no longer a compact. At least this provision is no longer a provision that both parties agreed to. So first off, the Interior Department is required by law to approve or at least review any changes in the compact. This is a change in the compact. I mean, even if it's only a change, even if the Senecas only considered it a change, the language wasn't there that said payments should continue past 14 years. So Lockport Journal, Buffalo News, it doesn't really matter what you say about what the arbitration panel has ruled. If they change the language of the compact, if something in the compact is changed, the Interior Department is supposed to review it. And I'll tell you, here's what they have to review now. Now they're not reviewing a revenue sharing agreement that both parties agreed to. Now they're reviewing changes in a revenue sharing agreement that one party doesn't agree to. The Senecas don't agree that payments should continue past they don't agree payments should continue at all. That they're done. They were done in 2016. Now here's the other thing the Interior Department is charged to do. And that's to review whether the revenue sharing agreement is legal under the underlying federal law in the first place. So as you guys, spin your wheels and take your shots at the Seneca Nation, because what, you think dilapidated fire trucks in Niagara Falls is the fault of the Seneca Nation, or potholes, or anything else you want to blame the Senecas for? Look, the mismanagement of municipal funds, whether it's Buffalo or Niagara Falls, and I'm not even including Salamanca in this. Salamanca's got rife with other problems, and part of their problems is that they don't have a tax base to support a city, and the city is on Seneca land. The Senecas should just take over the city and just run it. I mean, that's just the way it should be. But so Salamanca is a little bit different animal, and throwing more money through this revenue sharing with the state isn't going to solve Salamanca's problems. So if you're going to complain about the mismanagement of funds that Niagara Falls has been responsible for, and then say that's why the Senecas need to pay, well, you're missing the whole point. The Senecas aren't paying this revenue sharing to the state because of something Niagara Falls did for them. They're not under no obligation to pay the state just because they have a compact. In fact, that's prohibited by federal law. The only way the Senecas can be required to pay is if they agreed to something that the state was going to give to them that was of substantial value. That's not the revenue sharing provision that the state had, that they breached almost immediately. Within a couple of years, they started competing directly with the Senecas by putting slot machines in their horse racing tracks all over the state, but certainly in 3 of them, right within the so-called exclusivity zone. There was no exclusivity zone. To the extent that the state could put slot machines and turn racetracks into casinos, to the extent they could do that under their own law, forget about the compact. They competed to the fullest extent their law allowed. The compact didn't stop them from putting slot machines in these racetracks. I mean, they couldn't put. I mean, because let me back up here. They couldn't build casinos because their law prohibited. They couldn't put Class 3 slot machines in the racetracks because their law prohibited it. Not because of the compact. The compact said that the Senecas would have a protected market, and they didn't. They didn't have a protected market. And every slot machine that the state put in those racetracks made that exclusivity worth less and less and less. And now it's worthless. That's exactly what it is. So Buffalo News, Lockport Journal, all you other white folks who are just hating on the Senecas because you think the Senecas are somehow have gotten over on the state and on the local municipalities. I got to tell you, all that renovation, all this new building taking place at the in downtown Buffalo, near the Inner Harbor and all that stuff, that started with the Senecas, and they didn't get any cash assistance from the city of Buffalo or the state of New York. No, they just built it. And whatever assistance that the Senecas were supposed to have gotten from the state in opening up their first casino in Niagara Falls, which the state and the city of Niagara Falls wanted desperately because they saw money flowing across the river to the Canadian casinos. Whatever initially started that assisted the Senecas in getting the convention center, and then which was a white elephant. This is something that was costing the city of Niagara Falls money, and they took it off their hands. They paid them well for it, and then they got screwed on the adjacent property, overpaid like $24 million for a parking lot. I mean, so look, I mean, if you think the Senecas owe the state just because they opened up a casino, that's not the way it works. The only thing they could owe the state for is something the state gave them that was substantially beneficial to their business. Exclusivity could have been that, but they were never given exclusivity. They were given an area that was supposed to be an exclusivity zone, but then they didn't have market protection. So now the Interior Department has to look at the whole thing now, which is obviously not what the arbitration panel did. For those arbitrators to say, well, the Senecas are getting they're getting market protection for nothing. They're getting something for nothing. No, they aren't. They didn't get anything nearly worth $1.5 billion from the state. And in fact, if you and I've said this multiple times on the show, the operators of the state licensed casinos, they hope that the Senecas continue to pay for this worthless exclusivity, because you know what? They can't compete. They feel like they can't compete if the Senecas aren't paying their 30, 40, 50%. And it's not just 25%. It's 25% of the net slot drop, which is closer to 48% of the total revenue from the slot machines. The Senecas are probably paying a higher rate than the state licensed casinos. Really? And I'll tell you, there is more money going to the state than go to the Seneca people. Let that sink in. There is more money going to the state, or that has gone to the state of New York, than went to the Seneca people directly, or even indirectly. I mean, look, there's been good employment, and the Senecas have had, certainly have enjoyed expansion in buildings and a bunch of other things. They certainly have utilized these casinos to improve their quality of life. And in fact, what the Senecas took home from those casinos is much more notable, and is more evident than the 1.5, almost over 1.4, almost 1.5 billion that the state took. What state got to show for it? What does Niagara Falls have to show for? They got old fire trucks, for crying out loud. That's what Niagara Falls has to show for it. You know what happened? Niagara Falls became gaming addicts. They became addicted to gaming. Because without that revenue coming in, as the state violated their exclusivity and diminished the exclusivity provision to the point where it's worthless. And now that it's termed out, and again, the Senecas offer time and time again, look, you guys want to get together and talk about something that we can do to help the city? There's plenty that the Senecas could do. But nobody will come to the table. They're hoping that the strategy the state employed, which was to not clarify the language in the compact when they had the opportunity to do so in the run-up to the renewal, but they could hopefully get an arbitration panel to rule their way. Look, they threw the dice. I know, bad pun, right? They rolled the dice, and again, it turned out for them. They got two white guys on the arbitration panel to rule their way and say, look, nope, Seneca's got to continue to pay. Well, here's the problem. You just rewrote the compact, and now the Interior Department has to approve it. And this time, unlike in 2002, the Interior Department has to look at a compact where the parties do not agree. So this is essentially the state is in the position to say, we need the Interior Department to approve this change, even though the Senecas don't agree to it. I think that's a pretty heavy lift. So, and this is the law. I mean, this is your law. This is your federal government. It's not our federal government. You know what? The Senecas could do gaming with or without the state. And I know people say, well, they could just do class 2 and then they don't need a state or a compact or anything. I think the Senecas could do this stuff without a compact anyway. And if the state wants to walk away and say, look, we're not going to have a compact with these guys, well, go ahead and do it. There's nothing in the law, in federal law or state law, that gives the state the power to shut down an operating gaming facility by the Seneca Nation. So, I mean, I think it's really noteworthy that while these two publications, and the Lockport Journal is one of the, it's one of the bigger small newspapers in Western New York. I mean, on one end, look, you get craziness coming out of the Jamestown paper with I don't even remember the guy's name. One of those holy rollers, putting his racist stuff out there. And now you got, yeah, Pat Buchanan. That's what it is. Yeah, Pat Buchanan. I don't know why Jamestown newspaper carries the Pat Buchanan column, but so you got this guy writing his racist stuff, and then now you've got the Buffalo News calling the Seneca Nation cheats and liars, and now you got the Lockport Journal jumping on the Seneca saying they agreed to binding arbitration. Well, look, they agreed to use arbitration to solve a conflict, not to have the state rewrite the compact. And so if that's what the compact says, then or what the compact now says, because these two guys changed the language, it's simple. The Interior Department has to review it. It's a standard procedure. So to call out the Senecas as if they're doing something wrong, they're just protecting. Look, they're protecting themselves. And and I heard somebody say, "Well, how would the Senecas feel if they won an arbitration and the state appealed?" I don't think the Senecas would have had a problem. Well, for one, you can't appeal the ruling, but if the state try to do other strong arming against the Senecas, then the Senecas would have taken it on step by step. So, I mean, it's interesting that we live here in Western New York, Seneca territory. It's all ancestral Seneca territory. And those people who have now, dug in and made homes here. I mean, look, I even got to throw WBFO under the bus here a little bit. I mean, they did this whole thing about making Buffalo your home. They did this whole campaign on the NPR station here in Western New York. They said, whether you came here 100 years ago or just recently, we want to hear your story on how you made Buffalo your home. They completely left out the fact that there were people here before anybody came here 100 years ago. There was no invitation to hear from Native people who have always been here in Western New York. And I even raised the issue. I said, your campaign is a little bit racist because you're talking about people showing up, to make Buffalo their home now or 100 years ago. What about 200 years ago? What about 500 years ago? See, this is, look, I know when I call this stuff racist, people say, oh, there he goes dropping the race card. But that's exactly what this is. When you want to ignore a people who are distinct from you, and you automatically think that you are superior to them, and that we're bound to be obligated to you or to your government, your state government or your federal government, and then you want to ignore what you're obligated to under your own laws. I mean, you can clearly hear the tone in these two editorials from the Lockport Journal and from the Buffalo News. The tone is really clear. And unlike the Jamestown paper running a Pat Buchanan column, these are the newspapers that are writing this. This is the view of the newspaper, the editors, and these are the people who are supposed to have unbiased journalistic practices. Not so much. I mean, it would seem to me that anybody would say, look, this thing just needs to go through the process. But you know what? But the reason they don't is because they're looking at these municipalities, Niagara Falls in particular, and realizing that they are in dire straits, that their management of that city has been such that they aren't even taking care of their basic needs. I mean, Niagara Falls, they do a survey every year on the worst cities in the state. Niagara Falls was like number one. Buffalo and Niagara Falls were 1 and 2. I think they swapped out somewhere over the last couple of years. And it has to do with crime. It has to do with the conditions. Yeah. The only thing that Buffalo has has earned a spot for is that They say Buffalo might be the most resilient city when it comes to climate change. So the only thing that Buffalo hasn't been able to screw up is the nature of their natural protection from things like climate change. But in the meantime, you got Buffalo and Niagara Falls that are rife with crime. And you know what? This is the crazy part. Paul Deister, the mayor of Niagara Falls, he even went so far at a 9/11 commemoration last fall to suggest that the Senecas are responsible for an ill-prepared and unequipped first responder unit from Niagara Falls. He said the police are undermanned, the police are under-equipped, their fire department's under-equipped. I mean, he went on and on, just like the Lockport Journal did here, blaming the Senecas for the fact that this mayor has mismanaged the city to the point where that what he doesn't have he can't equip his police force and his fire department. I mean it's great to have a scapegoat, I guess, but the interesting thing is you would never hear a city say, "Oh, look what the Jews are doing to us," or "Look what the blacks are doing to us." I mean, you might get them to throw a little bit at refugees, I guess, or immigrants, but not even so much here in Western New York. In fact, places like Buffalo and Niagara Falls, they're glad there's an influx of immigrants because there's such an exodus of people leaving the cities that were it not for the immigrants coming in, documented or undocumented, their population. I mean, this Niagara Falls dropped below 50,000 a couple of years ago. I think it's. I mean, there's a threshold for what is a small city, and I mean it's got their population is shrinking year by year, and were it not for the influx of refugees and immigrants, Buffalo and Niagara Falls would be in dire trouble because with their population. So, and you want to blame the Seneca Nation? Let me, and again, I've mentioned this before, and I've got to reiterate it. Nobody is assessing the fact that the state has taken $1 billion out of gaming revenue out of the area. Oh, $1.5 billion got sent to the state, but about 400 million, almost half a billion came back to but the state kept $1 billion. $1 billion. So $1 billion was ripped out of the Western New York economy. And nobody from the Lockport Journal seems to be concerned about that. Nobody from the Buffalo News seems to be concerned about that. You don't hear Paul Deister or Byron Brown or anybody else saying, this revenue sharing hasn't really worked out for us either. Not only did it, did the state not negotiate a revenue sharing to continue, but they've actually violated the revenue sharing provision, their exclusivity, leaving us, without getting that revenue from the state. But the state's also taken $1 billion out of the area. You cannot tell me that when you take $1 billion out of an area that's already financially stressed, you don't think Buffalo has been impacted by $1 billion leaving Western New York? You don't think Niagara Falls has been impacted by $1 billion leaving Western New York? Of course they have been. But you don't hear the Lockport Journal talking about that. And you don't hear the Buffalo News talking about that. I mean, they've got great universities here in Western New York. They could pull an economist out of UB or Buff State or somebody or Canisius or one of these colleges and say, let's look at the economic impact of the state pulling $1 billion out of the area. I mean, look, there's lots of fanfare when Governor Cuomo says, "Oh, we're going to put $1 billion. We're going to call it the Buffalo Billion. We're going to send $1 billion to Western New York." Well, when's that happening? And how's that happening? Pay to play? It's been shrouded in controversy ever since that whole thing even began. And you know what? $1 billion hasn't come back, but $1 billion sure as hell left, and nobody's talking about that. So let's see you, Lockport Journal. Let's see you, Buffalo News. Let's see you do a story on the money that the state's taken from the area, not just what you think. Because I'll tell you, if it had stayed, and the money that Senecas are taking in now, all gets spent back here in Western New York. None of it goes to Albany. The Senecas don't pay money to Albany. Not anymore. Not anymore. All right, folks. Well, that's it for today. We will be back here on Tuesday, and again, keep in mind that I do a show in New York on Thursdays, and you can catch that show. We post it up on our website. We put it up as a podcast, and we put it up on our YouTube channel. So check out our show last week, which had Peter Dorico in it, and check out our show next week when we have Lance Gumbs join us, because you're gonna again see more racism that's not just from the right but from the white, and you're gonna see that in our show from New York this week as well. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.